Good morning, and to our participants online, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for joining us today for our special event. At this time, I would also like to thank the U.S. Department of State, Bureau of International Narcotics, and Law Enforcement for supporting the work of IFES, CELI, and partners on UNCAC implementation, including contributing to the Political Finance Implementation Toolkit being introduced today. Thanks also to the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency for their support to this event and IFES work on anti-corruption. My name is Uchechi Anyanwu, and I am a legal and anti-corruption officer with IFES's Center for Anti-Corruption and Democratic Trust. The new center was established in September to help address pervasive forms of political and electoral corruption that pose the greatest threats to democracy. We are an incubator for cross-sectoral partnerships and global initiatives that raise awareness of the issues and innovate to address them. Now that we are in a year of action, following the US-led Summit for Democracy, and as the second phase of UNCAC peer reviews are drawing to a close, a key focus for this 9th UNCAC Conference of State Parties is how to achieve not just the legal, but the practical implementation of UNCAC commitments. One critical area for action is political finance transparency. Political finance is often missing in discussions on the fight against corruption, but illicit funding and spending around elections has been called the original sin of corruption because of the way it builds and bonds corrupt links between the public and private sectors. This entrenches clientelism and influences peddling. Hence, if countries really want to tackle the roots of political corruption, push back on autocracy, and limit the flow of foreign or domestic funds into corrupting elections, then we have to confront opaque and illicit political funding and spending. UNCAC Article 7.3 and Paragraph 12 of the Political Declaration of the 2021 UN General Assembly Special Session Against Corruption, UNGAS, both recognize the importance of open, transparent, and accountable systems of political finance that enhance the integrity of the political process and ensure a level playing field for parties and candidates. Hence, as part of their responsibility to ensuring free and fair elections, state parties need to implement measures to ensure adequate transparency, accountability, and oversight in the financing of political parties, candidates for public office, and electoral campaigns. Clearly defined and enforced regulations may prevent corruption, ensure accountability, promote good governance, and reinforce trust in public institutions. To this end, IFES's Center for Anti-Corruption and Democratic Trust is hosting the special event with topic experts focused on practical mechanisms that can directly benefit policymakers and oversight institutions working on this issue. Our speakers for today's event are Alexander Dunoye from the US Department of State, Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, Ivan Presniakov, Deputy Head of the National Agency on Corruption Prevention, Ukraine, Lisa Klein, former Director for Party and Election Finance, UK Electoral Commission, who will be joining us online, and Magnus Oman, IFES's Senior Global Political Finance Advisor and Director of the Regional Europe Office. At this time, I'd like to hand over to Alexander for a few remarks.
Good morning, thank you. The US State Department is pleased to have supported this political finance implementation toolkit as part of the Effective Combat Against Corruption project. Transparency in political finance processes is fundamental to a well-functioning democracy. It can shine a light on potentially corrupt activity in which political candidates peddle influence in exchange for donations or campaign contributions. It is necessary to have a solid legislative and regulatory framework for transparent and accountable political finance. While a lot of attention has been paid to closing legal loopholes and shoring up these frameworks, less work has been done to support their implementation. That is why we are so excited by the great work that IFES has done to help government actors move from laws on the books to practical guidance for how to implement them. This toolkit fills a gap in the existing body of work on the topic by making the implementation of political finance standards accessible and comprehensible. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. Before we begin today's discussion, we'd like to take a moment to show you a very short video illustrating the connection between poorly regulated political finance and corruption.
We all lose something when money dominates politics. Your road might only get fixed right before Election Day. Your tax money might go to distributing favors rather than vaccines. The railway system that would shorten your commute might never be built because the company given the contract had political connections and can't finish the job. But does money in politics, also known as political finance, always lead to corruption? First things first, political finance refers to the ways that political parties and candidates raise and spend money for election campaigns. In many countries, there are laws that regulate how funding is sourced, used, and disclosed. In addition to its direct impact on the political process, political finance affects everyone because of the connection between money in the political process and corruption in the public sector. While not all political finance is corrupt, there are many ways it can be abused. Corruption is a politician padding their wallet or someone hired for a job because they made a campaign contribution. But it's not only that. On a large scale, corruption is the misdirection of policies and spending to enrich some at the expense of the real needs of the public. Ahead of elections, wealthy individuals may give large sums to parties or candidates willing to advance their interests. When campaigns are fueled by uncontrolled or undisclosed money, the outcome may not reflect the will of the voters. After winning, elected officials may feel bound to support their financiers, repeating the cycle of corruption, wasting public resources, and undermining democratic and economic competition. Another concern is the abuse of state resources, the illegal or inappropriate use of public funds to support electoral campaigns. One example is when incumbents increase pensions and state employees' salaries just ahead of elections to increase their popularity. This is sometimes against the law, but no matter what, it misuses resources and undermines the democratic process. Ultimately, this strengthens the incumbent's advantage, entrenches authoritarian regimes, and feeds kleptocracy. Breaking the link between money in politics and corruption requires dedicated effort. Public institutions that oversee political finance must be protected from political interference and have the authority to take on powerful stakeholders. Many groups must work together to create a legal and social framework to deter the corrupting influence of money in politics, including lawmakers, political parties, civil society groups, media, and voters. To learn more about how to clean up the political process, visit IFES.org.
To begin today's discussion, I now turn over to Magnus Oman.
Thank you very much, Uchechi. Before I begin, the video you just saw is available on IFES.org website. Feel free to share that with anyone. I'm Magnus Oman. I've spent most of the last 15 years working with public institutions, state institutions, mandated to oversee compliance with laws on political party and campaign finance in some 40 countries around the world. What I'm going to say now draws largely on that experience. This is work that aims both at preventing corruption in party and campaign finance, and also at increasing transparency and to create a level playing field. There's much discussion in different countries about what the rules should be. Should there be limits on how much anyone is allowed to donate to a party or a campaign? Should there be a limit on how much parties and campaigns are allowed to spend? Many stakeholders argue who should be allowed to make a donation, including companies, foreigners, those who are in debt, and companies that have public contracts. So the thing is, whether we have donation limits or spending limits or restrictions on who can make donations or on how money can be spent, it does not matter. Or rather, it only matters if we ensure that there are clear mechanisms for how such regulations can be monitored. And that is a very big if. It's interesting to know that all countries in the world have at least some regulations on party and campaign finance. And I know I've checked. However, the vast number of these regulations around the world are ignored, and violations often occur with total impunity. What can be done against this? Well, as a rule of thumb, do not introduce a political finance regulation. Do not even propose a political finance regulation unless you have a reasonably clear idea of how compliance with that regulation can be monitored and how violations of the regulation can be sanctioned. In practical terms, I really do suggest that each proposed reform, whether it be a draft legal amendment presented to Parliament or in a report by a civil society group, there should be an explanatory note following it saying, this is how we will implement this regulation in practice. I'll give you some practical examples, starting with an easy one. If you advocate for a ban on campaign donations by companies that hold public contracts, a very reasonable idea, you need to consider how do you make sure that the institution mandated to oversee that regulation has access to public procurement records and has a system for cross-checking donation records and public procurement records. This is a technical issue, but you won't believe how often it is forgotten. Another example, if you're going to set limits on how much a campaign can spend, you need to have a clear definition of what counts as campaign spending. Again, the legislation in most countries do not define this clearly. And it's also a good idea to have a requirement that campaign materials list on them who's paid for them. Okay, there's no doubt that there are public institutions in a number of countries that are mandated to oversee the implementation of political finance regulations, but that in practice have no intention of doing so. This can be because they are controlled by a certain political faction, or it can simply be that the people working for the institution want to keep their jobs and they don't want to take on powerful political actors, an attitude I can certainly understand. This is not an argument against ensuring that political finance regulations are implementation friendly. In fact, regulations that are difficult to implement create a perfect excuse for these institutions to do nothing. While with implementable regulations, it's much easier for us to advocate that these institutions should take action. So the implementability of regulations and the administrative burden on the administrating body must also be considered when we think about areas that are not currently regulated in most countries. Things like third-party financing, I prefer the term non-contestant campaigning, or spending on online advertising. I'm not saying we shouldn't regulate those areas, but I am saying that when we discuss regulating those areas, we need to consider how we can do it in practice to implement the rules without overburdening the implementing agencies. Quick word about sanctions. It is, of course, essential that we have effective, proportional, and dissuasive sanctions in the area of political finance, as with anything else that we are talking about at this Congress. I very often hear people say, well, the sanctions here, they must be much stricter. The ones we have are not dissuasive. My response then is always to ask, are there currently a lot of cases where sanctions are imposed, but the violators then continue to violate the rules? Because very often that isn't the case. In many countries, very few or none at all sanctions are imposed in practice. And in these cases, it may be more relevant for the institutions to have access to lighter or minor sanctions that are easy to be implemented than very strict or severe sanctions that look very good on paper, but that the judiciary is not going to implement in practice at all. We must remember that the notion of a sanction being dissuasive depends not only on how strict it is in itself, but also on whether potential violators expect that a sanction may actually be enforced in practice. Finally, I want to stress the importance of connecting what we are talking about during this event here and everything else we've been talking about during the Congress. Political finance oversight must be connected with other areas of anti-corruption work. This includes transparency in public procurement, to let us know connections between campaign donations and public contracts. This includes beneficial ownership transparency, allowing us to know who's actually behind those making donations and how those may benefit. It includes the gender impact of corruption. We need to know more about how corruption in the political process impacts women and men. We can take one important example, abuse of state resources or abuse of administrative resources. A lot of us suspect that there is a significant gendered impact of such abuses. But to be honest, we don't have the comparative data to actually prove this. So only when we connect our work on money in politics to other areas of work against corruption can we get a comprehensive approach, protecting us against political corruption and allowing us to build trust and confidence in the political process. This also requires that we ensure that political finance regulations are implemented in practice and that the institutions mandated to oversee them have the necessary independence, resources, and political will to act effectively. Thank you.
Thank you, Magnus. Now I turn over to Mr. Ivan Presniakov.
Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. Thanks very much for giving us the opportunity to share the particular case of Ukraine's and how the issue of transparency of political finances is dealt with in Ukraine at the moment. I represent the National Agency on Corruption Prevention, which is the body that has a rather broad mandate. And since 2016, we've been a part of this issue as well. In 2016 in Ukraine, we had a major changes in legal framework on political financing. And I think that the game changer at that time was the introduction of state financing of political parties that sit in the parliament of Ukraine. So this was a really big carrot, so to say, to political parties that was given by the state, and the stick was the system of quarterly reporting by political parties on their financial status, obligations, and expenditures, and the administrative and criminal sanctions for violating these rules. And I think that one of the major powers that our agency also received was that we were the agency tasked to allocate state funds. We were also the agency tasked to gather these financial reports and verify them. And if we find unreliable information in political parties' reports, especially on those parties who sit in the parliament, we have the power to suspend state financing of these parties for a quarter or two until they submit the report with right numbers and right figures, so until they fix it. Later in 2019, thanks to support from our partners and also from IFES, Ukraine also introduced the electronic system for gathering the reporting of political parties. So right now we have all these legal frameworks in place. I think it gives, in theory, it gives us good powers on how to make sure that the political finances in Ukraine are more transparent. And let me share with you some words on how this actually works in practice and what are the difficulties which we meet along this way. I think this will be, I mean, I believe our experience is a good case on which we all can learn. So in 2020, when the new leadership arrived to our agency, we focused very much on this specific mandate of verification of reports of political parties. And in 2020 and 2021, it happened so that our agency suspended the state funds for 3 political parties out of 5 who sit in the parliament. We asked them politely to resubmit their reports, and 2 of these parties did resubmit reports, and their funds were resumed. But another 1 party, they went to court, and we are still debating their case in the court. They went to court at the beginning of this year, and we still don't have a final solution of this case. And it happened so that after this, we made this move, so to say, the parliament decided that because of the COVID pandemic and because of the quarantine that we have in Ukraine, the submission of reports of political parties would be suspended until the end of the quarantine. So basically what we have right now is a situation that although we have all these powers and we had the chance to exercise these powers to make sure that the reports of political parties contain reliable information, it happens so that at the moment we don't receive these reports anymore. And actually yesterday and today the parliament was supposed to hear the draft law that gives back this power of ours to receive these reports, despite the fact that we still are in pandemic situation and we still have a quarantine in Ukraine. So what I think we learned from this experience is it's not only the application of sanctions, but it's also the interaction with political parties that has to take place, because, well, you need to balance. What we learned is that you really need to balance this carrot and stick approach, and you really need to be careful in implementing sanctions, and you need to accompany these by doing a lot of education and awareness raising also among politicians, among political parties, and especially among staff of political parties who actually do submit their reports and who work on these reports by their hands. Otherwise, it may be the case that although you start implementing the framework which is solid and which gives you very good powers to make sure that you can make a difference and to make the reporting system more transparent, you may end up in a situation when parties are firing back at you. We are very much, of course, hoping that this situation is temporary, and we are ready to resume our work with political parties to make sure that once they submit new reports, they know how to do it. They have all the knowledge and all the training from our side, and hopefully this will happen very soon. But we are still committed as an agency to make sure that we as a country make progress along this way, and that political parties will submit their reports now in electronic form to the registry that we already created with the support of IFES and USAID. And this will give another level of transparency to this system, because these reports will be available online to everyone who is interested, to civil society partners, to journalists. And this will give another level, yet another level of transparency to these reports. And this may also give us another leverage when we discuss the issues that we find in these reports with political parties. Because from now on, these will be not only our staff versus political party, but the whole of society could look into this report and see actually what we mean when we say that some information is unreliable. So it is a rocky road. We are still on the way to achieve much more, and but we are very hopeful that we are on the right way. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing the Ukrainian experience. At this time, I would turn over to Lisa Klein, joining us from online.
Good morning, and I'm very pleased to be able to join you from London this morning, where the sun has yet to rise, and to introduce you to a new IFES resource, which we call the Political Finance Implementation Toolkit, or for short version, PFIT. We've heard today from both Alexander and Magnus about the importance of the implementation of political finance legislation. So it may therefore come as a surprise to know that there are very, very few resources available on how to implement political finance laws. The only resource, if we go to the next slide, is of this kind is the Political Finance Oversight Handbook. Nikki, maybe we could go to the next slide. Yeah, this is the only current resource, and it was published 8 years ago. And as we all know, a tremendous amount has happened in this area within the last 8 years. So the next slide shows that the purpose of the PFIT tool is to address this resource gap, to be a guide for public oversight institutions and how to implement political finance laws and campaign finance regulations. The PFIT will be an online tool available to all oversight institutions and, of course, civil society organizations, researchers, and others, as is shown on the next slide. However, what we need to emphasize here is that this toolkit is targeted, really, the targeted audience is oversight institutions. And by that, I mean public bodies that are tasked with overseeing and enforcing political finance law. Next slide. A small core group of political finance experts with decades of operational experience in this area worked to develop the toolkit. But very importantly, we benefited from having consultations with and the input from oversight institutions from a broad range of countries, as is shown on this map. The toolkit will cover all aspects of implementation of political finance regulation, And if we go to the next slide, you'll see that there will be 3 parts essentially. And the first part is about the legislative framework. Now, as we've said in the beginning, there's a lot written about legislation in this area. So we are not intending this to be comprehensive in any means, but rather we're looking at it through the lens or the perspective of the oversight institutions themselves. This is very different because if you're looking at it from the issue of the legislature, different issues have to be addressed. But there are issues, and there are other resources that can address the needs and of the parliamentarians. Thus, we're really focusing in on what is important about the legislation from the perspective of oversight institutions. The next slide shows the part 2, which is the strategic framework and planning. This section is designed to assist oversight institutions in making sure that they have the appropriate strategies, policy, and planning in place. And I think those of us who have worked in this area for a while internationally have come to the view that a solid strategic framework and good planning are fundamental prerequisites to delivering the political and finance oversight role effectively and efficiently. And yet our work in many countries over the years reveals that these areas are often overlooked and underdeveloped. And hence we have put this forward. Even though it is important to political finance, it can help in other areas as well. But that is fundamentally the second part of PFIT. And finally, part 3 on the next slide is what I call the delivery of the remit. How do you actually focus on the role and the activities that you have to undertake as a political finance oversight institution? Now, these range from country to country, but they can include such things as how do you give advice and guidance about controlling the reports that are submitted, how you handle those issues of non-compliance, as we've heard Ukraine had done in terms of their reports submission, and possibly imposing sanctions. This section is very hands-on in terms of the day-to-day operations of political finance oversight institutions. It details the approach and the steps taken by various institutions and provide tips on good practice. A little bit more in the next slide about the structure of PFIT. There will be various levels. We're taking advantage of the tool being online and to make it as user-friendly as possible. So users will be able to navigate to areas of interest to them simply by clicking on links in the text and or using the navigation bar. Sections generally will consist of a topical overview, followed by a more in-depth discussion with links to helpful tips, also to templates, to country examples, and to case studies. So it's multidimensional in that sense. And finally, the final slide is that we intend to go live in early 2022, quite a way with dates. But really, this is just the launch because the toolkit will evolve organically in light of feedback from the users and the involvement of oversight institutions, either as commentators on the current version or as contributors. We would encourage various countries to submit case studies and any guides and tips they have for performing their roles. Ultimately, PFIT should be a resource not only for oversight institutions, but also one that is informed by their experiences and from oversight institutions from around the world. IFES will reach out through the normal channels to announce the actual launch of PFIT, social media, etc. But if you would like to receive notification directly, you can send a request for this by emailing database@ifes.org. And I thank you for your time and attention today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. We will open for questions and comments from the floor. While you think about questions you'll have, I will read out two that have come in because this meeting is also broadcast online. There was a question about the link to the IFES toolkit. I hope that Lisa answered that. If you email database@ifes.org, you can get that information. There's also a question online about how can oversight institutions be empowered to regulate party and campaign finance effectively. I have some thoughts, and I'd also like to hear from the Ukrainian experience, but while you have a chance to gather your thoughts, some of the things that I would emphasize, first is access to other data sources so that you can cross-check the information that you have received from parties and election campaigns with other data sources, be that a company register, public debt register, customs information, and so on. This can do two things. It can highlight transactions that are directly against the law. If there's a ban on people under 18 making a donation, it can show, oh, this person is only 12. Or it can put up a red flag saying this transaction is not against the law, but it seems a bit odd. So for example, if a large donation has been made by a person without an income, that's not, most countries that would not be illegal, but it's probably worth looking into. Quite often when institutions or sometimes journalists have looked into this, the response from the person reported as a donor, it's tended to be, what are you talking about? I never made a donation. It's just put into the record anyway. Oversight institutions need the right to request additional information from parties and campaigns. It can be valuable to have parallel reporting trails. So that means that complementing the information from parties and campaigns, we can also have banks, for example, or media companies selling advertising space being required to submit certain information. Bear in mind that that does increase the administrative burden on the oversight body. And in general, I think we need a balance between allowing the free financing of parties and campaigns, because we are talking about democratic actors, key democratic actors, and having control. And for me, one practical example of that is after the Ukrainian legal change in 2015, which introduced a new system with a lot of great advantages, one thing they got that wasn't right is that it became too difficult to make a donation. You needed to go to a bank pretty much and provide a lot of information to make a donation. It turned out that's too difficult. We want to encourage grassroots donations, and that was made difficult by that. That law has since changed and that has been corrected. But it's difficult to find this balance. How does this work in Ukraine?
Thank you. Well, first, just to echo what you said, indeed, access to data is crucial. And we are lucky to be guaranteed by law that we have access to all state-owned registers. And we already have a direct link to this register, so it works in a way that we can access it from our working spaces. So we don't need to send requests and spend a lot of time waiting for information. I think, but it's not only state-owned registers and databases in these modern times when the more and more political campaigning takes place online. I think it's crucial that we also have access to the data from, well, the Facebook has already opened their advertisement platforms, and it's much more transparent, and we can track and see how money are spent online in Facebook. It would be good to have similar tools applied to other platforms, for example, mainly Google, probably. I think it's still important to talk not only about how to empower regulator, how to give tools to regulator, but also how to motivate regulator to do this job. And in our case, the merit-based selection of the leadership of our agency played a crucial role, and also guarantees against politically biased dismissal of the leadership of our agency is also crucial. In a way, we are sure that once we start taking our job seriously, when we verify reports of political parties, we are sure that next day the leadership of the agency will not be voted out in the parliament. So, and I think it's obvious, but it has to be said, because otherwise you may have a lot of tools to do your job, but you will be very much reluctant to actually perform it according to standards.
Thank you very much for that. And our mysterious panelist, Lisa Klein, online, would also like to chip in on this. Please, Lisa.
Well, I'm very glad that our colleague from Ukraine mentioned. Can you hear me now? Okay. I wanted to mention also that if you're going to implement the law, you need to be resourced. The oversight institution needs the resources to do the job. And that can include having the right staff resources. That means both in terms of the number of staff. I've been in countries where they have a new law, but they only have 3 people allocated to do that work alongside their other job. So there has to really be the dedicated staff with the right level of skills to do it. And I just want to compliment our colleague from Ukraine to say that ultimately you have to have the will, the political will, to do the job. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Any questions from the room? Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you very much for yielding the floor to me. My name is Emmanuel from Nigeria. Mr. Oman, your presentation actually speaks to, if you like, some of the practical experiences we have in my country. I think we spend a great deal of time debating how stringent regulations should be, but with very little attention given to how these regulations are implemented. Indeed, as it is today, the National Electoral Body is the one charged with the responsibility of oversight of political financing. That responsibility, I must say, is really overwhelming on that body that spends much of its time dealing with other issues of politics, of oversighting the political parties and elections. So very little has been done in that area. And I wanted to chip in and ask, from your experience, is it a good practice that the National Electoral Body should also combine the oversight responsibility, or that responsibility should be charged to yet another separate body, as it were, so that the laws or regulations are implemented? Like I said, the experience shows that we are not even implementing 10% of those laws. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. And I can't stop myself from starting with my own pet theory, which is, I think that the election campaigns in Nigeria are the most expensive in the world. Taking into account the size of the economy, they are unbelievably expensive. This, of course, raises the importance of the issue. I certainly do see the challenges with having this responsibility given to a body that has so much else to do. We talk about INEC in this case, the Independent National Electoral Commission. There is both the issue of workload. there's also the issue that an election management body must very strictly be seen as being politically neutral. Of course, that's part of the key part of their job. That means that engaging with anything that can be seen as politically sensitive, and political finance is always political, you can't get away from that, becomes a problem. Having said that, we look at the key types of institutions that are given this responsibility in different parts of the world. It tends to be mainly the election management bodies, an audit institution, an anti-corruption institution, or something else. There are advantages and disadvantages with each solution, and we haven't really found that any one type is the best solution in itself. It really depends, as Lisa Klein was saying now, on the resources available to the institution, its political independence, and its political will to act. Just a final point, it may be worth, there's a temptation fairly often to create, well, none of the institutions we have are good to do this, so let's create a new one. Okay, that's okay, but quite a few countries have quite a number of institutions. There are quite a few commissions in Nigeria. If you drive around Abuja, there's commission after the commission after commission. It may not be a good idea to create a new one because they wouldn't necessarily have the expertise to be able to engage with this. So I'm not saying that it's good to have it with EMB, but what really matters is the independence, the resources, and the political will to act. Thank you. Any further questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you. I was wondering if you see the need to work towards more soft standards and principles under the UNCAC, so on a global level, because at this point, the UNCAC addresses the aspect of political finance transparency, but it doesn't really provide any more guidance. And there's a set of recommendations or principles from a working group from Prague 2 years ago. And that, I think, may slowly become a set of soft standards. But do you see the need to go beyond that, to develop more guidance, both on the regulation and on the implementation oversight of political finance transparency? Thank you.
Thank you very much for raising that. And you're right, UNCAC itself has one sub-article, 7.3, which says it's a good idea to have transparency, pretty much. I think the Prague principles that you mentioned, and if anyone is interested, we can share those with you, are as far as we're likely to get in terms of saying what the regulations should be, because we should recognize that perhaps more than in many other areas that we are talking about at this Congress, there will be a variation, and there should be a variation between countries and regions in how these issues are regulated. Because it's not only connected to corruption, it's also connected to political culture. So the rules, for example, in my native Sweden are completely different from the rules in the United States, and they should be, because we have different political cultures. Where I think we need to move forward is on two areas. One is regarding regulations themselves in ensuring that they are implementation friendly. As I mentioned earlier, that is not emphasized enough and is not considered enough. And I think that through UNCAC, we should focus on making sure that whatever regulations there are, we have an idea of how they're implemented. And the second area is simply the implementation itself. And we've talked a lot about public oversight institutions. I do want to stress the role of civil society and the role of media in this field. In many countries, more scandals, more violations, I should say, are uncovered by journalists than by oversight institutions. That's part of the nature of the work. So, thank you. Okay. no one can stop me, so I'm going to ask you a question, because I'm sitting in a room with experts on corruption. I would like to know, what do you think can or should be done to connect the work with an oversight of money in the political process, so parties and campaigns, so on, with the area of corruption that you work with? Because as I mentioned, I think there's a lot of synergies that we can get. So whether you work with public procurement or corruption in the health sector or in the environmental area, gender and corruption, I'd really like to know, where do you see the interplay between the areas you work with and the political process? Who would like to pick that up? Yes, madam.
Thank you. The delegation of Latvia. What we have found very important for us is that all the political party financing that they receive and their expenditure is being published online to be accessed by all the interested parties, including the civil society, the academia, and it allows us to have a wider understanding of what the political parties are using their funds for. Of course, it goes together with strong regulation on what the political parties are allowed to receive, how they are allowed to spend their campaigning expenses. And that allows us to see that no government administrative resources are being used within this political campaigning. And having these reviews has, I would say, made a little bit more order in the way that we talk with the political parties and how they understand us as a monitoring body. So from our perspective, including the transparency and online publication of these issues has been a very positive development. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Imam Shafi Abdul Karim from Nigeria. I represent the Interfaith Coalition Against Corruption in Nigeria. Yeah, giving answers to your question, what the Interreligious Coalition Against Corruption is doing, especially as Nigeria prepares for the 2023 election in terms of political financing. As part of our studies, we discovered that the corruption that is being perpetrated in Nigeria is as a result of too heavy budget politicians are spending to get to political offices. So our campaign and advocacy to the Independent Electoral Commission and also the party secretariat is that the money for registration of political office aspirants should be reduced drastically in a situation whereby you're asking them to pay huge amount of money. Some of them go into debt by borrowing the banks. Some of them find any other means to put up this money to get to the office. And the first thing they do when assuming those political office is to steal those money and get it back to replace from where they have taken the loan. And by implication, most of the projects and the deliverables of governance are not being delivered to the people, because these people, till the end of their tenure, they are still paying debt or they are still trying to make gains. So this has turned into like commercializing the political landscape. Also to the fact that we're also campaigning against vote buying. This is very, very prominent in the Nigerian political space, whereby the politicians induces the electorate in terms of paying them to vote for them. This also goes into the accumulated budget of financing their political ambition. So for preparing for 2023, we as an interreligious coalition body against corruption, we are trying to look at this and also engage the political stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Good morning. This is Ali Baro from Lebanon, responsible for the implementation of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy. I believe that I revised many of the strategies, anti-corruption strategies. One of the important issues way forward is to introduce the political financing in the national strategies, because, you know, every authority, anti-corruption authorities, would be working on strategies, key performance indicators. So this is one thing. The other issue is that there might be a kind of guidelines for evaluating each campaign or each activity. You see, because there's a problem here where there are some formal or official expenses that auditors are allowed to audit and present before the commission, and there are non-informal or other activities. There might be a problem in evaluating this. So there might be a kind of guidelines that put a value based on the country-specific conditions. This might be added to the overall campaign or budget for every candidate. And thus we can go and check how did he acquire this financing from and the sources of funds. These are my...
Thank you very much. And I will hand over to my colleague Uchechi. I do want to encourage everyone after the event, so if you please come forward, we're very happy to continue the discussion. Uchechi, please.
Thank you, Magnus. Before we bring our session to a close, I would like to bring your attention to the first ever guide focused specifically on turning analysis into action on the ground. IFES and the Seeley Institute developed Piercing the Veil, using peer reviews in the fight against corruption to be different from other guides in that it focuses less on contributing to peer review reports or doing shadow reports. Instead, what it offers is practical steps to help implement peer review recommendations. It walks its readers through a series of practical activities to help them understand the review processes, analyze and synthesize the reports they yield, amplify important messages, set priorities for anti-corruption initiatives, and engage in action planning to drive meaningful change. We see it as a very important tool for civil society organizations, international organizations, donors, and other relevant stakeholders. And this guide has been made possible by the generous support of the American people through the US Department of State, Bureau of International Narcotics, and Law Enforcement Affairs. With that, I turn it back to Magnus for concluding remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Uchechi. I simply want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank the State Department and INL and the Swedish government for supporting this event. If you have any questions, please come forward. If you're interested in the political finance implementation toolkit that Lisa Klein was talking about, send us an email at database@ifes.org and we'll inform you when in early next year it will be available. Thank you very much.